Welcome to using fertility awareness methods during your postpartum period for natural contraception. This is an abbreviated version of the entire course around fertility awareness. This is just what, and here when I say fertility awareness, I should expand fertility awareness for confident contraception or fertility awareness for natural contraception. I use those two course names interchangeably. Uh, so they mean exactly the same thing. It's just sometimes I reference to it as fertility awareness for confident contraception. Sometimes it's fertility awareness for natural contraception. What this hones in on is what you need during your postpartum phase. You're already, as a new mom or a repeat mom, you're already swamped. And so this is limiting the scope of the conversation to just what you need to get you through things. We are going to do a brief, there will be a module, or there is a module on anatomy, like the anatomy of your reproductive organs, how those work, and physiology. To be perfectly honest, you don't really even need those. You just need this section, the content in this section on using fertility awareness methods during postpartum. The one that we are going to focus on is the Marquette method. And the reason for that is because many women who have been using fertility awareness methods prior to getting pregnant choose to switch over to the Marquette method during postpartum because it creates peace of mind. There's more days that you're able to enjoy unprotected sex on average compared to cervical fluid monitoring methods. And it's really objective, so you don't have to think about it. And as a new mom, or again, as a repeat mom, whatever the case may be, with a new baby in the house, that is likely welcome news for you. So we are going to focus just on the Marquette method during this section, or, during this course, this fertility awareness for confident contraception postpartum module. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about considerations during your postpartum phase. In this section, we're going to just do a really broad overview of essentially what's going on with your body now that you've given birth. Let's get right into it. When does your fertility return once you've given birth? We're going to talk about this more in the next video. The answer is it depends. That's not a very pleasant answer. If you aren't breastfeeding at all, then you may begin to ovulate as early as 4 weeks after giving birth. So that is about 28 days or about 1 month after giving birth. For women who are breastfeeding, so if you are breastfeeding that first 56 days, so your first 8 weeks after giving birth is considered anovulatory as long as you meet certain criteria. We're going to go over what those criteria are in this section. There's also a download for you to, as a quick reference, because you're likely overwhelmed as a new mom. The truth is, about 20% of breastfeeding women ovulate within 6 months of their baby's birth, and about 65% of women ovulate within 12 months of giving birth. And that's a really big range. 6 months from giving birth to 6 months, and there's a 20% chance that you're going to ovulate during that period. And then again, a really big range between 6 months and a year. So you really want to know when you're ovulating, so you know when to avoid sex so that you don't get pregnant right after just having a baby. Whether this is because you want to space your pregnancies or whether this is because you'd like to, you know, be done with growing your family. Either one. What's considered? So first of all, we're going to talk about lactational amenorrhea method. And with this, that first 56 days after giving birth, you're able to assume that you are infertile if you're breastfeeding. And this is also exclusive breastfeeding. So what qualifies as exclusive breastfeeding? Well, your baby receives breast milk only, and this is the baby's only source of liquids, the baby's only source of food. The gap between feeding sessions is not more than 4 hours during the day and not more than 6 hours at night. Your baby suckles for comfort, so you offer your breast for comfort. It's not just for feeding, it's also using your breast rather than a pacifier or any other sort of comfort items for your child. There's no set feeding schedule. So this means that your baby's choosing the feeding schedule on any given day. And then lastly, pumping accounts for less than 20% of your feedings because let's be real, sometimes you're likely going to have to pump. And as long as pumping accounts for less than 20% of breastfeeding sessions, then you're still qualified in this exclusive breastfeeding. So with that, you're able to use lactational amenorrhea as your method of contraception or your method of contraception for the first 56 days. So for the first 8 weeks after pregnancy or after giving birth. And then you're going to want to add in a fertility awareness method in order to be confident that your fertility has not returned. There are 3 main criteria for using the lactational amenorrhea method successfully. The first of those is your baby is less than 6 months old. So this falls into that 56-day window, plus tacking on an extra 4 months for you for being able to use lactational amenorrhea method. You haven't had any vaginal bleeding since your lochia flow stopped, and your baby is exclusively breastfeeding. And again, we talked a couple of slides back on what exclusively breastfeeding looks like. If you don't meet all 3 of these criteria, then you need a backup method of fertility awareness. In the postpartum phase, so using fertility awareness to avoid pregnancy during postpartum. Once you've given birth, your fertility typically, and I say typically here because yes, there are several studies that show this is how fertility returns. It doesn't mean that you're going to follow this exact pattern and you're not going to like skip steps or something. Typically, this is what it looks like. So to begin with, there's return of follicular activities, which means that your follicular stimulating hormone rises without ovulation. When this happens, there's no chance of pregnancy. So this is a result either of prolactin levels dropping. If you are breastfeeding, then those prolactin levels drop, and that allows FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, to start being made again by your pituitary. Or if you aren't breastfeeding, then all of the hormones associated with pregnancy, so your HCG levels, prolactin would drop because you don't have that stimulus of a suckling babe. And all the other levels, like your progesterone level falls back down to baseline, your estriol levels, diminish. The estrogen that's associated with pregnancy, that estriol drops off. So you'll have a return of follicular stimulating hormone levels rising, without ovulation. With this, there's no chance of you getting pregnant. Next, your ovulation returns, but the luteal phase is deficient. So there's no chance of implantation, or even if a fertilized embryo happens to implant within your uterus, you're likely to miscarry because your uterine lining isn't well enough developed to sustain a successful pregnancy. And then the third buildup in this pattern is full fertility returns. And of course, you want to know you want to know where you are in that spectrum when you're trying to avoid pregnancy during your postpartum phase. As I mentioned in the overview to fertility awareness for natural contraception during postpartum, many women who have been using fertility awareness methods or natural family planning methods prior to getting pregnant switch to the Marquette method after giving birth because of the extra peace of mind that Marquette provides. Marquette also provides a dramatic increase in the number of safe days during your postpartum phase when you're able to have unprotected sex without the risk of pregnancy. There was a study that shows that essentially there's about a 30% reduction in the number of potentially fertile days when you're using the Marquette method versus a cervical mucus monitoring method. And so that reduction of 30% means that, there's 30% more days for you to have unprotected sex using Marquette compared with a cervical mucus or cervical fluid monitoring method. So one of the reasons why cervical fluid monitoring methods are so tricky postpartum is because essentially pregnancy kind of rejuvenates and revitalizes your reproductive organs. And so this means that cervical secretions are both typically more abundant post-pregnancy, so post-giving birth, post-delivery, and that also even your vaginal secretions are more abundant after delivery. And so what this does is it makes it really difficult to gauge what type of cervical fluid you have because, you also have vaginal secretions that are kind of interfering with your ability to read your cervical fluid. And you're like, well, is this arousal fluid or is this actually cervical secretions? And then also because the cervical secretions are just more abundant typically after delivery, then it makes it really tricky on using a cervical fluid based method postpartum. And so again, Marquette just really, it provides a standardized way of determining whether or not you're fertile, like which days you're actually fertile. And it just gives you that added reassurance. It's a number, it's very objective. You test, you get an L, H, or P on your Clear Blue fertility monitor, and you know whether you're safe or not that day. Done. So let's take a look at kind of how this is broken down into what do I want to say? Like what this looks like for using Marquette during your postpartum window. So immediately after you give birth, you expect to have lochial flow for several weeks. Once that lochial flow stops, then you're in cycle 0. And this is where it's kind of referred to as a no man's land. You have no idea when your fertility returns. This is often true whether or not you're breastfeeding. So even if you're not breastfeeding, it can be pretty wildly variable on when your fertility returns. And then you have your first menses. And chances are that you ovulate before you have your first menses. And so then it's possible, because of course, if you ovulate, then it's possible to get pregnant. So you want to know before you have that first menses whether or not you've ovulated. And then cycles 1 to 6, so after cycle 0, Marquette has very specific rules for postpartum. And Marquette actually did a study among about 200 women. Now, while only about 15 of these were non-breastfeeding women, the results were still really great on using this Marquette protocol for the postpartum period. So among those nearly 200 women, there was a 98% efficacy rate over the course of 12 months. So that means that within 12 months, 98% of the women did not get pregnant. 2% of the women did get pregnant. After your first 6 cycles, which have a which will follow the postpartum protocol that we'll talk about in the next video, then you transition back over to your standard protocol. We'll talk about more about what that looks like after we talk about what you do for those cycles 1 to 6.